So the oil crisis of 1973. So what we've talked about up to now is we've talked a little bit about the early days of the environmental movement with DDT and pesticides in front yards. And then, of course, Rachel Carson and Silent Spring. And then that kind of led to more and more stuff in the 60s, kind of culminating in the 1970 Earth Day, which we still celebrate every year today. But I want to talk about another element to this, and this is going to set up several future lectures in this class. And it's a very small, quick topic. It doesn't take much to get through it. That's the oil crisis of 1973, sometimes known as the OPEC oil crisis of 1973. So let me quickly explain this. Now, you and I, our whole lives, and I know I'm twice the age of most of you, but our whole lives, we've kind of had this idea that gas and oil can be expensive, that there are limits to it, that we have to get a lot of this oil from other countries. But up until the 70s, gas was not an issue for Americans. We provided most of our own gas. Nobody ever thought about it running out. In fact, most things, and we talked about this a little bit with Silent Spring, most things we didn't think about limits of nature. This is the first time that with gas and oil that we realize there is a limited amount. And this is also becoming a period where in the 70s where we're beginning to realize there's limits to a lot of nature. So this is up until the 70s, people didn't worry about how much gas their car used because it was so cheap. It was cheaper than milk. I mean, you just didn't even think about it. I mean, in 1950, it was 19 cents a gallon to maybe a quarter a gallon by 1959. Even as late as 1969, it was still less than 35 cents a gallon. I mean, in other words, the gas prices have barely gone up in 20 years. But in the 70s, it went from 36 cents to, by the end of the decade, nearly $1, and in some places, well over $1. I mean, we're talking a very quick inflation rate for gas, and that has a lot of unintended consequences elsewhere in the economy and in society. So how does this begin? Well, it begins with something known as the 6-Day War. Another aspect of this topic, and this is really outside of this class, but when I talk about it in my other classes, this is one of the things I make a point of. If you were to go to most Americans in the 50s and 60s and talk about the Middle East, they would have very little concept. They would go, oh, that's where the Bible is, that's where the pyramids are, that's where all the camels are, but there wouldn't have been a whole lot of recognition of the Middle East in the way there is today. That all changes in the 70s. And this is one of the things, the oil crisis is one of the reasons why the Middle East starts to become a major focus of Americans. I mean, now, especially post 9/11, Middle East is a huge part of world affairs and of politics. So in June 1967, you have something known as the 6-Day War. Some of you may know Israel, the Jewish state, created in 1948, which is always, which U.S. had always supported, seen as somewhat of a Western nation in the middle of the Middle East. It was not very popular with some of the other more Arabic countries. And Arabic means a culture, it's a specific culture. Some of these other Arabic nations and Persian nations, a lot of them primarily Muslim in their religious focus. And they were never very happy with Israel. They felt like this was basically the West coming in and carving out some space. And so there's always been a lot of tension between Israel and Egypt and some of these other nations. So in 1967, there had been a lot of saber rattling between these nations. So Israel decided to take the initiative and they attacked Syria and Egypt, and they captured what's known as the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. I think I have a quick map here so you can see the Sinai Peninsula, this huge thing right in the middle of the screen. And then just above it, you see what's known as the Gaza Strip. So basically, Israel doubled their size. And this was incredibly embarrassing to some of these other countries. They couldn't believe that Israel had done this. Again, most Americans weren't really paying attention to this unless they were into world affairs or, maybe if they had connections to Israel. But for the most part, most Americans, this was just something that happened off screen, if you will. 6 years later, you get what's known as the Yom Kippur War. And this was in October 1973. This was an attempt by some of these Arabic nations to take back what they lost in the 6-Day War, and maybe even get rid of Israel in the process. So they, this was during Ramadan, which was during which is a Muslim period, a holiday period. So again, people assume, you know, you're not going to attack. It's like attacking during Christmas for us. But it also was Yom Kippur this year. And it does move around each year, but basically the Day of Atonement, a very sacred holiday for Jews. And so again, that was not an accident that it was during this period. So they attacked Syria and Egypt and other Arabic nations, including Iraq and Jordan. And initially the surprise did work, but ultimately Israel, yet again, was victorious and a ceasefire was called. Now, even though Europe and the United States did not officially fight in this, but we did side with Israel, and Israel had gotten arms from us and supplies from us. So we were seen as, again, obviously an ally with Israel. Israel, by the way, not only did they get more territory, not only did they not get their territory taken away, they actually got a little bit more territory, including getting control of the Suez Canal. You know, this was an incredible embarrassment for the rest of the countries in the Middle East. So there is a direct response to this. There's a group called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Producing Nations. Now, by the 1970s, empires are gone, colonies are gone. So you have a lot of what we used to call third world nations. Today, we would use the term developing nation. But nations that are very small, many of these are former colonies of say, Europe, that now they're independent countries and they have resources like oil. But individually, they're not that powerful, right? But kind of like a union, collectively, they can have real power. And again, nations like Jordan, Indonesia, Algeria, Nigeria, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Qatar are just some of the nations involved in this. Now, there's kind of a Middle Eastern contingent, but you also have nations in other parts of the world as well. And collectively, they can set oil prices and have huge impact on the rest of the world. And this is really the moment where they realize, again, that they actually have an impact. Because what they decided to do was to punish nations like the US, Japan, and much of Western Europe for supporting Israel. So they embargoed oil. And something what that means is they quit selling us oil, or in some cases sold less oil than they normally would. And what, of course, the supply goes down, the demand goes up, and so prices go up. So very quickly, gas prices doubled. And in fact, in some areas, much more than that. You started seeing gas lines. And they did this in 73, but they would continue to do this off and on throughout the 70s. So this became kind of a regular thing. Some areas to try to conserve, again, Americans had never had to think about saving gas. Now, we still produce a lot of our oil at this point. This affected places like Japan much worse than it affected the US. Japan got almost all of their energy from oil and almost all of their oil from the Middle East. So this crippled Japan for a while. America wasn't quite as bad, but nonetheless. So this is the first time Americans ever had to deal with, you know, having, you know, gas shortages. But this just wasn't something we ever thought about. So a lot of areas would have it where, depending on what your license tag number was, you know, whether it ended in an even number or an odd number, that dictated which day of the week you got gas. I mean, some places like, okay, if it's an even number, you can get, I mean, I don't actually remember the exact, but like, you know, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, if it's an even number, Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday, if it's an odd number, you know. So, and people started thinking about how much energy, you know, how much gas their car used. People started, like people using, you know, thermostats started turning them down a little bit. In other words, there's starting to be a focus on conserving energy a little bit. And so these high gas prices and shortages, again, had a huge impact. And this obviously had impact on the American economy. It had an impact on national politics. I mean, this would basically dominate national politics throughout the 70s and early 80s. Richard Nixon was president at this point, Gerald Ford later, Jimmy Carter later, Ronald Reagan. All of these are going to be affected by these gas prices. And again, suddenly the Middle East is starting to be a focus for Americans. Another unintended consequence, and this is a rather comical one, but it still is quite revealing. Johnny Carson, some of you might know who that is. He was the host of The Tonight Show Today it's Jimmy Fallon. Before him, it was Jay Leno. But from the early 60s all the way up to 1992, it was Johnny Carson. And when he was the host of The Tonight Show, it was a different world in that there were only 3 main networks. Nobody did late night television except NBC. And for years, it was only The Tonight Show. It came on 11:30 to originally 11:30, I think, to 1:30. Then it went down to 11:30 to 1 o'clock. And then now it's 11:30 to 12:30. Even before Saturday Night Live, this was it. People watched The Tonight Show. And Johnny Carson he wasn't the first host, but he was the most important host. He was hugely influential. And whenever there was a big event, people would tune in to the monologue to see what he would say. And again, this is pre-YouTube, so you had to watch it live. And of course, not surprisingly, Johnny Carson talked about the OPEC oil crisis several times. And one of the days, as this was hitting and the impacts were coming in, he had read a newspaper article that Japan had, they were almost entirely dependent on the Middle East for oil. And their toilet paper was, because you don't always think about what oil is used for. I mean, it's not just for your car, it's used for all kinds of stuff. And, oil in Japan was used for the production of toilet paper. And he just thought that was a funny idea that they might have a toilet paper shortage. So he made a joke about it. And in fact, I have a clip of it down below. You can watch the actual clip itself. That actually had an impact because, and this sounds kind of familiar, going through the COVID crisis, this actually sounds very familiar. People heard that joke and laughed, especially back then because toilets weren't something you talked about on TV. They laughed, but then a lot of people went, that could happen to here. And I don't want to run out of toilet paper. So within a couple of days, people ran out and bought loads and loads of toilet paper. And there was an actual brief toilet paper crisis in America that ties in with, just because Johnny Carson made a joke about it. He later apparently made a joke about, like, I shouldn't have said that. And again, I used to tell this to students and they couldn't believe it. And now that we've gone through COVID and we've had toilet paper shortages, even though there never should have been one, it's funny, history has kind of repeated itself 40 years later. Another repercussion was, again, the focus on where does energy come from? And in this particular case, a lot of oil obviously is coming out of the Middle East, and suddenly the Middle East becomes important in American politics and world affairs in a way that it really hadn't been before. So this is a picture of Ayatollah Khomeini, who later becomes the leader of Iran. He wasn't leader at this point, but I know for people of a certain age, when we thought of the Middle East, this is who we thought of. We still live in this world today where the Middle East has a massive impact on our lives. This is when that began. And again, this goes back to energy. Other people started thinking, kind of being influenced by Silent Spring and Earth Day, but then sort of really instigated by this oil energy crisis. A lot of people thought, well, it's finally time maybe to put in some conservation curves to try to maybe limit how much we're using. And so one of those was speed limits. There have been a lot of debates of whether there should be some kind of national speed limit, the idea being that if you don't go quite as fast, it's safer, and you're not going to burn quite as much oil because you're going a little bit slower. So there was set up a national speed limit of 55 miles per hour. Now, if you know your Constitution, you might be going, how could that happen? Because doesn't that violate state rights? And there's a way they could do this. You can set it up so that you can't really tell a state, because the states, you can do it on federal highways, but for state highways and state roads and county roads, you can't really tell them that that's a division of power. But what you can say is, if you don't do this, you won't get federal funding. And most of the states and counties get federal funding for roads. So this is often how things like that happen. So in 1974, the Emergency Highway Conservation Act was passed. This is under Gerald Ford, and 55 miles per hour essentially became the national speed limit, double nickel, as it was referred to. And that would last until 1987. There's a few that didn't do this. I mean, some states like Montana and Nevada just said, in fact, they didn't even have a limit. They just said no limit. They got it in a couple other states, sort of didn't really, but for the most part, especially Florida and Georgia, it was 55. And I remember in 87, I was 15. I was just starting to drive when when they started changing it to 65 and 70. And I couldn't believe it. It seemed like crazy talk. And in fact, kind of as a nudge, cars were instructed, a standard for cars was that when you had your speedometer, I should have a photo of this and I don't, it goes, from zero, speedometers used to go from 0 to 200, they said, okay, the speedometer cannot go past 120. The argument was, if you have a 200 there, people are going to try to do it one day. Let's see if I can get it to 200. So the idea was, let's limit it. We just won't have any number past 120. And 55 was bigger than all the other numbers on the speedometer, as basically saying, remember, 55, don't go past 55. That's not the case anymore. Cars numbers go way up. You don't see the 55 bigger. Again, they haven't done that since 1987. It also turned out that it didn't have any impact on oil consumption, by the way. And two, even though you shouldn't go too fast, but the actual statistics of accidents they went down a little bit. So it did have a tiny impact, but nowhere near enough. And so in 1987, that was rejected. So most of you probably didn't even know that there was an unofficial 55 mile per hour speed limit. And in fact, I have a song, it's an old early 80s song by Sammy Hagar called I Can't Drive 55. And today that would make absolutely no sense, but it made a lot of sense in the early 80s. And in fact, it was a pretty big hit. Oh, there it is. I forgot I had this picture up here. So that was the 45, the single that came out, and it was a big hit. And again, as you can tell already, there's a growing perception that energy conservation is a thing that we need to do. So this is really for the first time people start talking about, let's turn our lights out when we leave a room, when you're brushing your teeth, maybe turn the water off until don't just let it run while you're brushing your teeth, things like that. Which are kind of standard practices today. But this is when all that began. And we'll be coming back to that a little bit later. Another thing we're going to come back later is this is the beginning of people beginning to turn to nuclear power. You have the atomic bombs in 1945. And then by the 50s, people are saying, hey, look, we can get a lot of energy by splitting or fusing an atom. There have been some nuclear power plants around. But with the OPEC oil crisis, the thought was we need alternative energy, something we still talk a lot about today. And nuclear power can be that, because when everything is right, nuclear power is pretty incredible and it can be quite clean. The problem is there's waste associated with it. And if something goes wrong, it can be very damaging. That comes back later. So suddenly you begin to see lots of nuclear power plants open up, including in Georgia and Florida, across the nation. Japan basically shifts from dependence on oil to nuclear power. Russia starts focusing on nuclear power. And later, we're going to talk about things like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl, which were major, and Fukushima, which were major nuclear disasters, which changed that. Because it'd be interesting what you guys just thought. When you heard nuclear power, did you go, yay? Or did you think, ooh, I don't want nuclear power. That's bad. Anyway, those are some of the unintended consequences of the Yom Kippur War. There was an OPEC oil crisis that raised gas prices, but it had all these other effects as well. Okay, that's it. Very short lecture today. I will see you guys in class.